How to be present in conversations. Let's face it, we live in a world of utter distraction. We have so many things competing for our attention. And yet at the core of human interaction is the simple conversation, and yet it's so difficult to be present. Today, I want to talk about 3 different stages of the conversation and how we might be more present. And why is that important? Because greater presence, more effectiveness in our conversations. You know, we live in a world of distraction, and no greater distraction than the wonderful mobile phone. We need to be connected to it because it's the source of all information, and yet it gets in the way of simple conversations. No more can we sit at a meal table and have a conversation. How many times have we seen this photograph happening at a restaurant where people aren't even having a conversation? What they're doing is they're speaking with others on the iPhone, or even worse, texting each other. The reality is we have a hunger. We have never been more connected in the world, and yet we've been never more disconnected. And so really what the hunger is to truly be listened to, and we will listen to in wonderful conversations. Today, I want to focus on 3 different elements of the conversation and how to practice presence to help us have really effective and meaningful conversations. So the first way to prepare to be more present in a conversation is actually even before the conversation happens. It's pre-conversation. Can we prepare especially for an important conversation? What are some of the things that we need to think about? Number 1, what do I know about this person I'm about to have a conversation with? What do I know about how they will show up? Do I have any biases that I'm bringing to this conversation that I need to be aware of because it can influence how I'm going to show up or the listening that I have to that person? Also, what time of day is this conversation going to happen at? If I'm a morning person and the conversation is in the evening, then I need to be aware that perhaps my focus, my attention, and my energy may be lower, and that's something I need to consider. If you're like me, most of my days go at breakneck speed, and so if we're about to have a conversation, we have to deliberately take a moment to breathe and to slow down. Otherwise, that transition into a conversation is going to make listening incredibly difficult. And then finally, we need to focus on triggers. If this conversation is going to be an emotional conversation, if there's going to be an emotional weight to it, I need to consider, am I going to be triggered? What emotions might happen in that conversation? And do I have a strategy for dealing with those emotions in the moment? If we want to be present in a conversation, it begins even before we begin that conversation. The next step is the beginning of the conversation. You see, at the beginning of the conversation, there's a lot of critical elements that are happening that will impact how present we are for that conversation. So the first thing is, can I get rid of all these different distractions? We're kind of fooling ourselves because many of us think that we can multitask, that we can do a number of different things at once. But you know, the scientific data is back and it's very clear. There is no way we can multitask. What's happening is that we are dividing our attention and we are putting it in one thing and then the other, and we fool ourselves because we move our attention very quickly. But the problem is this: even in the moving very quickly, there is a little gap of attention, and as we move to the next focus of our attention, we have lost a little bit of our presence. And so therefore, as we begin a conversation, let's take away some of the distractions. A phone, a mobile phone sitting on the desk, even if we are not looking at it, is an opportunity to distract us throughout the conversation. Even worse sometimes is sitting next to a computer on the desk and thinking that sometimes we can do a little work on our computer and still be focused. You know, I learned this lesson early in my career. I had a wonderful bookkeeper who also was pretty courageous and would tell the boss whatever she thought. Well, I also thought that I could multitask. So here I am having my weekly meeting with her, and I'm typing away and looking at her, giving all the appropriate nonverbal signals, and she stopped me and she said, "Irvine, really, you're being disrespectful." And I said, "Me? I'm not disrespectful. I'm very respectful towards you. Yeah, but when you give attention to your computer and then also to me, I feel disrespected. I feel that you're not present in this conversation. Lesson learned. And then moving on from that, it's can we offer nonverbal respect to the person? Can we engage our presence nonverbally? What do I mean by this? When we've removed all the different distractions, what we want to show the person is that we are non-verbally connected to them. And so we're turned, our torso is directed towards them. We're engaged with that person non-verbally. Nothing is getting in the way. I always suggest to leaders, if possible, and they have enough room in their office, is to get away from the back of a desk and to move to the front of the desk to engage in a conversation with a person who really is looking for a deep and meaningful conversation. That's a way of saying, I am non-verbally connected. I want to be present with you. So think about that, how you begin a conversation, because it will set the environment for the rest of the conversation, and it sends a signal to the person you're having a conversation with that I'm engaged and that I'm present. And then during the conversation, if we want to be present, first of all, we have to ask ourselves, how is my listening ability in the midst of this conversation? Am I aware of the blocks? Because sometimes we all have listening blocks, and we need to be aware of those blocks that might be getting in the way from myself being fully present in that conversation. So sometimes we fall victim to rehearsing the answer that we want to make. Sometimes during a conversation, we find ourselves in our mind trying to formulate the answer that we're going to give. And as soon as we're in the mind formulating our answer, we've really stopped being present and listening. The second thing is sometimes our listening block is that we have to win the argument. Instead of approaching it in a non-judgmental way, approaching it really trying to be curious rather than winning the argument. So can I bring a curiosity to my listening? Can I be curious of each thing that the person is saying? Because curiosity will lead to a better listening and a deeper listening. Sometimes if the conversation is tense, sometimes if it's emotionally laden, we have to be careful that sometimes our listening block is that we want to placate, we want to give in. And rather than dealing with something that's deep and meaningful and getting to the core of what needs to be discussed, we kind of give up in the conversation and say, whatever you want. So do we have enough self-awareness to realize that during the conversation, we need to be fully present even when we're feeling uncomfortable, especially when we're feeling uncomfortable, so that we can be curious about what's at the core of the substance of this conversation. And then once we've dealt with listening blocks, we also have to add some great listening techniques that help us be more present in the moment during that conversation. The first I can think of is silence. Silence is golden at times when it comes to conversation. At times we will get a person to speak much more that if we can become a little more comfortable and not feel the need to insert ourselves when there's a moment of silence. Are we able to label some of the emotions that we're hearing from the other person? Are we able to acknowledge, without having to agree, but acknowledge what's happening with that other person? That's a real sign of presence. It's a sign that I'm listening, and it's a sign that I am curious and want to learn more about what's happening. And then finally, when it comes to during the conversation, we also want to be careful about what types of questions am I asking? Are my questions closed? Am I just looking for yes or no? Or are my questions open? Are they curious questions? One of the best questions that I find in any conversation that you want to get to the core of what's happening and you want to show your curiosity is 3 simple words. Tell me more. Tell me more. That can evoke amazing answers and can really get us to the place in a conversation where we haven't got to before. So there we have it. Being present in a conversation happens before the even conversation begins. As we set up that conversation, there are critical things that we can do, especially with our nonverbals, that signal, yes, I'm engaged, I want to be present. And then throughout the conversation, we continue to signal to the other person, I am engaged, I am present, I am listening, and I want to know more, I'm curious. If you can integrate these practices into your conversation, believe me, people will begin to notice, and the feedback you will receive will be that in some way something is different and I feel listened to in a way that I've never felt listened to before. When you think about it, most of our workdays can be broken down into a set of different conversations. And so therefore being present in those conversations is so incredibly important. Now, part of the techniques and part of the skills that we've mentioned today are really based in mindfulness.